They told you civilization started in a muddy cave in Europe while the rest of the world was playing catch up. That's the first lie. The second lie is that black history is only about what happened on this planet. What if I told you that a tribe in Mali, the Dogon people, knew more about the cosmos thousands of years ago than NASA did in the 1970s? They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have satellites. They didn't have billion-dollar laboratories. But they had the blueprints to the universe. Specifically, they knew about a star called Sirius B. Now, here's why that should make your skin crawl. Sirius B is a white dwarf. It is invisible to the naked eye. You cannot see it with even the strongest backyard telescope today. Western scientists didn't even confirm its existence until 1862, and they didn't take a photo of it until 1970. Yet, for centuries, the Dogon were out in the desert drawing its exact elliptical orbit in the sand. They knew it was heavy. They knew it was small. They knew it took 50 years to circle its big brother, Sirius A. Ask yourself, how does a primitive tribe in the cliffs of Bandiagara describe the density of a star that is essentially a compressed diamond floating in deep space? It wasn't a lucky guess. You don't guess orbital mechanics and the specific gravity of white dwarfs while sitting around a fire. They knew because the source of their knowledge didn't come from a textbook. It came from a connection to the stars that the modern world has been trained to forget. We're taught to look down at our chains, but our ancestors were busy looking up at their origins. The Dogon claimed they were visited by beings called the Nommo, amphibious masters who came from the Sirius system to jumpstart human consciousness. Now, mainstream scholars love to call this mythology or aliens. They'll say anything to avoid admitting that black people had a grasp on advanced physics and astronomy while Europe was still figuring out how to use a fork. This isn't just about a star, it's about a betrayal of history. If the Dogon knew about the invisible mechanics of the galaxy, what else were they right about? And why was this information suppressed until white scientists could discover it and put their own names on the paperwork? The reality is that the Dogon are the living keepers of a science that predates the very concept of the West. They describe Sirius B as Po Tolo. Po is the name of a tiny seed, and Tolo means star. They called it the smallest thing in the sky, but the heaviest. That is a perfect scientific description of a white dwarf star, thousands of years before the term white dwarf was ever coined. We are talking about a level of precision that defies every single thing you were taught in school. They didn't just know where the star was. They knew what it was made of. They knew the universe was a spiral. They knew about the moons of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn without a single piece of glass to look through. Man, imagine being the people who taught the world the math of the heavens, only to be told you weren't civilized enough to own your own land. This is the ultimate receipts over rumors moment. The Dogon didn't need a telescope because they were the descendants of the architects who mapped the grid in the first place. When you realize they erased this science to keep you feeling small, it hits different. They want you to think your ancestors were primitive, so you don't realize you carry the DNA of galactic navigators. If the Dogon were right about the star they couldn't see, what does that say about the history they tell us we can't remember? The real reason they want to keep the Dogon in the mythology category is because the moment you admit their history is literal, the entire Western scientific timeline catches a flat tire. Let's talk about the Nommo. The Dogon don't describe them as cuddly gods or winged angels. They describe them as amphibious masters, beings of water and vibration who came from the Sirius system. Now, don't get distracted by the alien label the Discovery Channel likes to use. Think about the physics. The Dogon say the Nommo divided their bodies to give knowledge to man. In the West, they call that splitting the atom or genetic engineering. Our ancestors just called it Saturday. Here is the part that'll make you question every textbook you ever bought. The Dogon described the Nommo arriving in a vessel that landed with a sound like a tearing of the sky and stayed supported on 4 massive pillars that turned into water. They're describing a localized atmospheric displacement. They're describing propulsion. And they say these beings didn't just give them star charts, they gave them the Sigi ceremony, a 60-year cycle that tracks the renewal of the world. Why 60 years? Because it aligns perfectly with the orbital period of the planets they shouldn't have known existed. Mainstream science spent decades trying to say some white traveler must have wandered into the Mali desert in the early 1900s and taught the Dogon about Sirius B. That's their favorite move, intellectual colonization. They'd rather believe in a time-traveling tourist than a brilliant black mind. But that lie fell apart when researchers realized the Dogon artifacts tracking these stars are hundreds of years old. You can't teach a tribe a secret star and then have them show you a wooden mask of it from 3 centuries ago. The math doesn't check out, and it wasn't just the stars. The Dogon knew about the circulation of blood in the human body long before William Harvey discovered it in 1628. They knew about the structure of the brain. They knew that the universe was made of Amma's egg, an infinite spiral that is constantly expanding. Does that sound like a primitive tribe to you? Or does it sound like a people who were handed the keys to the laboratory? They understood that matter is composed of tiny, vibrating threads, what modern physicists now call string theory. They were discussing quantum mechanics under the baobab tree while Europe was still wondering if the Earth was a pancake. Why does this matter to you right now? Because the erasure of Dogon science is the blueprint for the erasure of your potential. If they can make you believe your people were discovered without a brain in their heads, they can make you believe you need permission to lead today. The Dogon didn't ask for permission to map the galaxy. They didn't wait for a telescope to tell them the truth. They looked at the universe and saw a mirror. They understood that the same iron in the heart of Sirius B is the same iron flowing in your veins. The betrayal isn't just that they stole the land. It's that they stole the credit for the thinking. Every time NASA launches a probe to study the mysteries of deep space, they are just fact-checking the oral history of a black tribe in Mali. They are spending billions to prove what our elders already drew in the dirt. But they'll never tell you that. They'll give the mission a Greek name like Apollo or Artemis to keep the credit in Europe, while the actual science was birthed in the dark skin of the Nile and the Niger. But here's the kicker. The Dogon say Sirius B isn't just a star, it's the source. They say that life on Earth didn't just happen, it was seeded. And if the Dogon are right about the invisible star, and they're right about the orbital math, and they're right about the blood circulation, then they're probably right about where we actually come from. And that's the part that terrifies the establishment. Because if you realize you aren't the descendant of a subject, but the descendant of a galactic pioneer, you become impossible to control. If you think the Dogon were an isolated fluke, you're still falling for the trap. The science in Mali wasn't a bubble. It was the overflow from the Nile Valley. We're taught that Egypt, or Kemet, was this mystical land of pyramids and mummies, but the history books leave out the most dangerous part. Kemet was a black African laboratory of cosmic physics. Those pyramids at Giza, they aren't just tombs for ego-tripping kings. They are astronomical transponders. They are aligned to the stars with a precision that modern GPS struggles to match. The Great Pyramid is oriented to true north within 3/60ths of a degree. But here is the meat they don't want you to chew on. The three pyramids of Giza are a perfect terrestrial map of the belt of Orion. Why Orion? Because the ancient Kushites and Egyptians knew that the heavens and the earth were a unified circuit. They didn't just build stone structures, they built a mirror of the sky to ground celestial energy into the African soil. This is the concept of as above, so below, long before it was co-opted by secret societies in Europe. While the rest of the world was struggling to stack rocks, our ancestors were calculating the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cosmic cycle. You don't track a 26,000-year cycle by accident. You do it with a written record and a scientific tradition that spans millennia. But check the betrayal. Western experts spent a century trying to prove that the people who built these masterpieces weren't black. They'll tell you they were Mediterranean, or Middle Eastern, or even aliens. Anything but the dark-skinned Africans whose DNA is still found in the remains. They literally broke the noses off the statues to hide the African features, then had the nerve to say the builders were mystery people. The mystery isn't who built them. The mystery is why the world is so scared to admit that the foundation of math, geometry, and structural engineering is 100% African. Look at the Temple of Dendera. Inside, there is a zodiac that tracks the constellations with terrifying accuracy. It shows the stars exactly where they were thousands of years ago. To do that, you need a deep understanding of trigonometry and spherical geometry. The Greeks, like Pythagoras and Plato, didn't invent this math. They did what every hungry student does. They went to Africa. They spent decades in the temples of Kemet begging for crumbs of knowledge from black priests who had already mastered the universe. When they went back to Greece, they put their names on the work and called it philosophy. We're talking about a stolen legacy that is hiding in plain sight. Every time you see an obelisk in Washington, D.C. or London, you're looking at a Tenu, an African symbol of the creative spark and cosmic alignment. They stole the stone, they stole the math, and they stole the credit. They want you to believe that black people were just muscle for history, while the mind was always European. But you can't build a pyramid with just muscle. You build it with a mind that understands the curvature of the earth and the speed of light. The real meat is that this science wasn't just for show. It was functional. They understood that the earth is a living battery. They used granite, a quartz-bearing stone, to build these structures because quartz is piezoelectric. It generates an electric charge under pressure. The Great Pyramid wasn't a silent grave. It was a resonance chamber. They were manipulating frequency and vibration to elevate human consciousness and maybe even power their civilization in ways we are too modern to understand. Ask yourself, if they're willing to lie about who built the pyramids, what else are they lying about? They've got you thinking that history started with a boat in 1619, so you don't realize you belong to the people who mapped the stars and harnessed the Earth's energy. They didn't just take your ancestors' bodies. They tried to delete the fact that your ancestors owned the smartest minds on the planet. When you reclaim the science, The chains don't just break, they melt. If you think the Nile was the only place where the black mind was rewriting the laws of reality, you've been looking at a map with the lights off. Let's head west, deep into the heart of Mali, to a place they love to call a legend, just so they don't have to call it a university, Timbuktu. By the 12th century, while Europe was literally burning women for knowing how to use herbs, Timbuktu was a global sanctuary for advanced physics, chemistry, and mathematics. We're talking about the University of Sankore, where 25,000 students, black students, were studying manuscripts that laid out the foundations of the world. But here's the kicker they never tell you. These weren't just religious poems. They were scientific journals. There are over 700,000 manuscripts sitting in Timbuktu right now that prove our ancestors were tracking the movement of planets, documenting the medicinal properties of plants, and solving complex algebraic equations before the word algebra even hit the European tongue. They had a system of optics that understood how light reflected and refracted. They were performing eye surgeries, removing cataracts with hollow needles in the middle of the desert while the great doctors of Europe were still trying to cure headaches with leeches and prayer. The betrayal is in the branding. They want you to think Africa was an oral tradition continent. Why? Because if it's just oral, it's myth. If it's written, it's history. By labeling Africa as purely oral, they justify burning the libraries and burying the books. They wanted to make sure that when you look back, you saw a blank page. But the pages aren't blank, they're just hidden. The French and the British spent the 19th century looting these manuscripts or letting them rot in the sun because a black man with a calculus book is a threat to the entire colonial narrative. Think about the math. The binary system, the very ones and zeros that run the phone in your hand right now, doesn't come from a Silicon Valley lab. It traces its roots back to African divination systems like the Ifa of Nigeria and the geomancy of the Bamana. They were using 16-bit logic gates to map human destiny and atmospheric patterns centuries ago. Western scholars like Gottfried Leibniz discovered binary in the 1600s, but he was just translating an ancient African logic that had already been vibrating through the continent for millennia. They tell you that Timbuktu was remote and isolated. Man, please. Timbuktu was the Google of the 14th century. It was the center of a trade network that moved gold, salt, and, most importantly, intellect. Mansa Musa didn't just crash the price of gold in Cairo because he was flashy. He did it to show the world that the center of gravity had shifted to black Africa. He brought architects like Abu Ishaq al-Sahili back with him to build mosques and universities that used fractal geometry in their design. Fractal geometry, the math of nature, the math of the universe, was the standard for African architecture while Europe was still building flat, drafty boxes. This isn't just about being smart. This is about the power of the record. When they burned the libraries of Alexandria and later suppressed the scripts of Timbuktu, they weren't just destroying paper. They were destroying the evidence of your intellectual DNA. They wanted to create a world where a black child feels like a guest in a science classroom. But you aren't a guest. You're the landlord. The very laws of physics they're teaching you were first observed, recorded, and refined by people who looked exactly like you. The real question is, if we had the eye surgery, the binary code, and the star charts 800 years ago, where would we be now? If they hadn't spent the last 400 years trying to make us forget we knew how to read the universe, they didn't just steal your labor, They tried to lobotomize your history, but the manuscripts are still there. The knowledge is still in the soil. And the moment you stop asking for a seat at their table and realize you built the room, the game is over. You ever wonder how a continent that mapped the stars and pioneered eye surgery suddenly became the dark continent in the eyes of the world? It wasn't a slow fade, it was a professional heist. Around the mid 1400s, the power players in Europe realized they couldn't compete with African science, so they decided to steal the soul of the people behind it. Enter the year 1452. Pope Nicholas V issued a secret memo called the Dum Diversas. This wasn't just a religious document, it was a hit and run on the human race. He gave the kings of Europe the divine right to invade, search out, and capture all Saracens and pagans and reduce them to perpetual servitude. This was the legal foundation for the theft of your identity. But here is the meat they don't want you to digest. The physical theft of the land was only possible after the psychological theft of the history. To justify taking the gold and the bodies, they had to pretend the brains didn't exist. They started a global campaign of historical whitewashing. Look at the statues in the museums. Notice anything missing? The noses. For centuries, European explorers and archaeologists systematically smashed the noses off of African statues in Egypt and across the continent. Why? Because the nose doesn't lie. A nose tells you the race of the ruler. If the world saw the broad noses and full lips of the builders of civilization, they'd realize that the people they were putting in chains were the ones who taught them how to read. This was the birth of the Hamitic hypothesis, the most disrespectful lie in the history of academia. European scholars argued that anything civilized found in Africa must have been brought there by a mysterious group of light-skinned outsiders. If they found a massive stone city like Great Zimbabwe, they said the Phoenicians built it. If they saw the Dogon star charts, they said a European traveler whispered the secret. They created a world where the black man could be a worker, a singer, or a dancer, but never the architect. They literally bleached the textbooks to make you think your contribution to the world started with a cotton bag. The real betrayal is the Renaissance itself. We're taught it was a rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas. But what they don't tell you is that Europe didn't have those ideas. They had lost them during their own dark ages. The Moors were the ones who saved those texts, translated them, improved them with African math, and then practically begged Europe to wake up. Europe took the homework, changed the name on the top of the paper, and then burned the person who handed it to them. They didn't just borrow the science, they appropriated the very image of God. Look at the images of Christ and the saints from before the 1400s. In the oldest cathedrals of Russia, Ethiopia, and even Rome, the icons are dark-skinned. But during the 15th and 16th centuries, the Borgia family and other powerful elites commissioned artists to repaint the heavens in their own image. They knew that if they could control the image of the divine, they could control the mind of the oppressed. If God looks like the oppressor, then resistance feels like sin. That is the ultimate dark psychology. They turned the creator into a white man's brand and marketed it to the very people they were stripping of their humanity. Why did they go to such lengths? Because a people who know they built the pyramids can't be kept in a field for 400 years. A people who know their ancestors mapped the invisible stars of Sirius won't accept a second-class seat in a society their science built. The eraser was a tactical necessity. They had to make you forget you were a king so you wouldn't mind being a servant. They had to make you think your history was a void so they could fill it with their narrative of discovery. The receipts are everywhere, but you have to stop looking at the labels they put on the exhibits. When you see a Greek philosopher, look at where he went to school. When you see a Spanish ship, look at the African navigation that kept it afloat. When you see a European university, look at the Moorish curriculum that gave it life. They stole the blueprints, built the building, and then charged you rent to stand outside. It's time to stop paying. It's time to realize that the dark continent was actually the light of the world, and they only called it dark because they were blinded by the shine. If you want to know how they really broke the back of the diaspora, you have to look at the boardrooms of the 1500s. They didn't just take the land, they took the mirror of the soul. See, before the mid-16th century, the world saw the divine in every color. But the power players in Rome realized that if you're going to keep a whole race of people in a state of perpetual servitude, you can't have them praying to a god that looks like their father. You have to make the creator look like the captor. This wasn't a spiritual shift, it was a military strategy. During the Council of Trent in 1545, the church elites realized that art was the most powerful weapon in the world. They started commissioning artists to systematically replace the ancient, dark-skinned icons of Europe with the features of the ruling families. They hired Michelangelo and Da Vinci to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and create the standard image of the divine. Why do you think the most famous image of Christ looks exactly like Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI? It was a family portrait disguised as a universal truth. They replaced the ancient, woolly-haired, African-featured prophets with the image of a Renaissance Italian prince. Think about the dark psychology of that. When a black man goes to his knees to pray, and the image of the high and holy looks exactly like the man holding the whip, the resistance dies in the mind before the body even moves. It creates a psychological loop of inferiority. You start to think that light is holy and dark is cursed. This wasn't just religion. It was the first mass media brainwashing campaign in human history. They turned the image of the divine into a no trespassing sign for black empowerment. But here is the receipt they tried to burn. The oldest Bibles in the world, the ones found in the mountains of Ethiopia, don't show a European heaven. They show black prophets, black angels, and a black Messiah. The Ethiopian Garima Gospels, written on goat skin in the 4th century, are the oldest illustrated Christian books on earth. They show the truth before the whitewash crew got their hands on the brushes. But when the European powers invaded, they didn't just steal the gold. They stole the scrolls. They buried the Ethiopian books because those books prove that the entire religious narrative of the West is a 500-year-old marketing campaign. They want you to believe that Christianity was a gift from Europe to Africa. Man, that's the ultimate gaslighting. Africa was practicing the core of these spiritual truths while Europe was still worshiping trees and thunder. The Desert Fathers, the great scholars of the early church like St. Augustine and St. Athanasius. These were black Africans from Hippo and Alexandria. They built the theology, they wrote the books, and then Europe took the books, repainted the authors, and sold them back to us as civilization. This is why they get so nervous when you start talking about the Moors or the Ethiopian Bible. It pulls the rug out from under the entire structure of white supremacy. If the foundations of your faith are African, if the foundations of your math are African, and if the foundations of your science are African, then what exactly did Europe discover? The answer is nothing. They didn't discover a new world. They stumbled into a global network they weren't smart enough to join, so they decided to destroy it and claimed they invented the ruins. Every time you look at a stained glass window today, you are looking at a crime scene. You are looking at the evidence of an identity theft so large it encompasses the entire globe. They broke the image to break the people. But once you realize that the image was a lie, the spell is broken. You aren't returning to civilization. You are the source of it. And if they had to work this hard for 500 years with art, law, and fire just to make you forget who you are, imagine how much they must fear who you're about to become. They want you to believe that the high-tech world we live in, the binary code, the algorithms, the data streams, is a European miracle born in a garage in California. That's a fairy tale. The meat of the matter is that the very logic running your smartphone was perfected in the dirt of West Africa thousands of years before the first computer chip was even a dream. We're talking about the IFA system of the Yoruba and the geomancy of the Bamana. These weren't just fortune-telling tricks. They were the world's first 16-bit binary systems. They used a series of marks, ones and zeros, to create 256 combinations that could map out every possible outcome in human life and nature. When the European scholar Gottfried Leibniz invented modern binary in the 17th century, he didn't pull it out of thin air. He was studying the records of missionaries and travelers who had seen these primitive African systems in action. He took the African logic, stripped the spiritual context, and called it a Western breakthrough. You are literally holding African mathematics in your hand every time you send a text, but they won't tell you that in a STEM class. They'd rather you think your ancestors were primitive, so you don't realize you are the natural-born architect of the digital age. And it wasn't just the logic, it was the biological science. While Europe was still trying to figure out why people got sick, African healers in the 1700s were already practicing inoculation. When a smallpox epidemic hit Boston in 1721, it wasn't a Western doctor who saved the city. It was an enslaved African man named Onesimus. He told his owner, Cotton Mather, about a practice back home in Africa where they would take a small amount of the disease and scratch it into a healthy person's skin to build immunity. It worked. The savages had mastered immunology while the civilized world was still bleeding people with leeches to balance the humors. But look at the twist. Onesimus didn't get a medical degree or a statue. He stayed a slave, and the credit for discovering vaccination went to Edward Jenner decades later. This is the pattern. They take the tech, they take the medicine, and they bury the name of the source. They want you to think Africa was just a continent of natural resources and unskilled labor. Man, if the labor was unskilled, why were they specifically kidnapping people from the Rice Coast because of their advanced knowledge of hydraulic engineering and irrigation? They weren't just stealing bodies, they were stealing patents. They tell you that the Industrial Revolution happened because of European ingenuity. The truth is, it happened because they had access to centuries of African metallurgical secrets. The iron-working techniques found in the Haya people of Tanzania, who were producing high-grade carbon steel in furnaces that reached 1,800 degrees Celsius nearly 2,000 years ago, were light years ahead of anything in Europe. Europe didn't develop steel. They reverse engineered it from the people they conquered. Ask yourself, if the foundation of the digital world is African binary, And the foundation of modern medicine is African inoculation, and the foundation of the industrial age is African metallurgy. What exactly is Western about Western civilization? The answer is the marketing. They are the great middlemen of history. They took the raw brilliance of the black mind, polished it, put a "Made in Europe" sticker on it, and then sold it back to the world as a reason for their own superiority. The real dark psychology is making the creator feel like a consumer. They've got you consuming technology that is fundamentally yours and feeling like you're catching up to a world you actually started. You aren't entering the tech space, you are returning to your own laboratory. Once you realize that the binary code in your pocket is just the modern echo of your ancestors' voices, the intimidation of the white tech world vanishes. You don't need a seat at their table when you're the one who provided the wood, the nails, and the blueprints for the room. Let's get into the raw logistics of how the darkness of Europe was actually cured by an African needle. We're taught that the Renaissance was some magical, spontaneous combustion of genius in Italy. But that's like saying a car started itself without a key or gas. The key was the Moorish invasion of 711 AD. When those black and brown Berbers and Arabs crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, they didn't just bring swords. They brought the first streetlights Europe had ever seen. While the royalty in London and Paris was literally throwing their own waste out of windows into the mud, the Moors in Cordoba were walking on paved, illuminated streets. They had 700 public baths, while the rest of Europe considered bathing a sin or a health hazard. But here is the meat that will make you realize how deep the theft goes. The Moors brought paper. Before the Moors, Europe was writing on expensive animal skins, parchment. It was slow, it was rare, and it kept the masses illiterate. The Moors established paper mills in Zativa and Valencia, using African techniques to turn hemp and linen into a medium for mass communication. Without Moorish paper, the printing press is just a heavy paperweight. Without Moorish paper, the scientific revolution has nowhere to record its data. They gave Europe the ability to think on a scale it had never imagined, then watched as Europe used that same paper to write the laws that would eventually classify the Moors as subhuman. Look at the universities. Oxford, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne didn't just pop up out of the ground. They were modeled directly after the Moorish madrasas of Spain and North Africa. The very concept of the degree, the cap and gown, the graduation ceremony, is a direct copy of the Moorish system. The gown itself is a derivative of the Arab thobe. Our ancestors created the blueprint for higher education. Then, Europe took the blueprints, built the schools, and banned the original architects from the classroom. They wanted the curriculum, but they didn't want the culture. The dark psychology here is the label swap. They took Moorish chemistry, alchemia, and called it science. They took Moorish algebra, al-jabr, and called it mathematics. They took Moorish optics and called it physics. By removing the al from the beginning of the words, they tried to remove the identity of the people who mastered them. They wanted to make the knowledge feel universal, so they didn't have to admit it was African. It's the ultimate academic stick-up. They stripped the name off the invention and then patented the silence. And don't even get me started on the music and the soul. The guitar, that's the Moorish oud. The troubadours of Europe, they were just imitators of the Moorish poets who brought the concept of courtly love and rhyme to a continent that was still grunting in prose. The Moors taught Europe how to eat, how to dress, and how to sing. They introduced spices, citrus, and the concept of changing clothes with the seasons. They civilized a continent that was in a state of primitive decay, and the thanks they got was the Inquisition. The betrayal is that history portrays the Reconquista as a liberation. Liberation from what? From hygiene, from math, from libraries. When the Spanish finally took Granada in 1492, they didn't libellate the city. They decapitated the brain of the world. They burned over 1 million Moorish books in the squares of Granada. They wanted to ensure that no one could ever prove that the White West was actually built on a black foundation. They burned the evidence of their own tutoring so they could claim they were self-taught. Ask yourself, if the Moors were the ones who taught Europe how to wash their faces, map the stars, and build universities, why does the modern world view the African as a student of the West? It's because the winners of the war didn't just take the land, they took the narrative. They turned the masters into servants and the thieves into heroes. But the architecture doesn't lie. The words don't lie. The very structure of the modern world is a Moorish skeleton dressed in European clothes. Once you see the bones, you can never unsee the truth. If you still think NASA is the pinnacle of human achievement, you're missing the fact that they're basically just using an African remote control to steer their ships. Let's talk about the Dogon and the Sirius system again, but this time, let's look at the specific physics that the West is still trying to decode. The Dogon didn't just know about Sirius B, they knew about Sirius C, a third star they call Ya. For decades, Western astronomers laughed. They said, 2 stars is a stretch for primitives, but 3. Now you're just making stuff up. Then, in 1995, French astronomers used gravitational perturbation analysis to confirm that a third star, a small red dwarf, actually exists in that system. But here is the meat that will flip your perspective. The Dogon describe Ya as the son of women. They say it's the star that governs the spiritual and biological rhythms of the feminine principle, while the West treats astronomy like a cold, dead map of rocks and gas. Our ancestors understood that the stars are biological resonators. They knew that the frequency of the Sirius system interacts with the melanin in your skin. Melanin isn't just a pigment for sun protection. It's a superconductor. It absorbs radiation across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, from UV to X-rays, and converts it into energy. Your ancestors weren't sun worshippers. They were biophotonic engineers. They built their civilizations where the starlight was strongest because they were literally plugged in to the cosmic grid. Look at the Dogon's knowledge of the moons of Jupiter. They knew Jupiter had 4 main moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, centuries before Galileo invented the telescope. How? They weren't looking through glass. They were looking through the pineal gland. In ancient Kemet, they called it the Eye of Heru. They knew that when you decalcify the pineal gland through specific African diets and spiritual vibrations, it acts as a biological telescope. It allows you to perceive wavelengths of light that the normal human eye can't see. The primitive labels were just a cover story to hide the fact that our ancestors had developed a biological technology that makes Silicon Valley look like a pile of Legos. The betrayal is that they've convinced you that technology has to be something you buy in a box. They want you to think you need an iPhone to be connected, so you don't realize your own body is the most advanced hardware in the known universe. By suppressing the science of the Dogon and the priests of Kemet, they disconnected you from your own power supply. They made you think science is something that happens in a lab in Switzerland, when the real science is happening inside your cells every time you step into the sun. Ask yourself, why did the CIA and the French government spend so much time in the 1930s and 40s embedded with the Dogon? They weren't there to learn about folklore. They were there because they realized a tribe in a cave had the mathematical proof of the universe's expansion that Einstein was still scratching his head over. They mined the Dogon for data, classified it, and then told the public that the Dogon were just imaginative. It's the ultimate academic gaslighting. They stole the frequency, built the radio, and then told you that the music belongs to them. This isn't just a fun fact for the cookout. This is about the psychology of superiority. If they can make you believe that the stars are out of your reach, they can make you believe that your freedom is out of your reach. But the Dogon proved that the cosmos is your backyard. You aren't a minority on a small planet. You are a cosmic stakeholder in a galaxy that your ancestors already mapped, named, and understood. The Dark Ages weren't a time of ignorance. They were the time when the West unplugged the African light so they could pretend they were the ones who turned it on. Everything we've discussed, the Dogon star maps, the Moorish streetlights, the Ethiopian Bibles, and the stolen binary code, leads to one unavoidable truth. The world you're living in is a counterfeit. It's a simulation designed by people who found the master key in Africa, changed the locks, and then tried to convince you that you were born in the hallway. They spent 5 centuries and trillions of dollars on a global campaign of psychological warfare just to keep you from realizing that the modern world is actually just a low-resolution copy of your ancestors' original design. But here is the meat of the final reveal. The theft of history was never about the past. It was about the future. They didn't bury the Dogon's knowledge of Sirius because they cared about old stars. They buried it because that knowledge is the manual for human potential. They know that a person who understands the biophotonic nature of their own melanin, the way it converts light into consciousness, is a person who cannot be drugged, distracted, or defeated. If you realize your DNA is a living archive of galactic navigation, you stop asking for civil rights and start exercising natural authority. The real dark psychology was making you believe that empowerment is something you buy or vote for. They want you focused on the political theater so you don't notice that the entire infrastructure of their power, the math, the physics, and the navigation, is built on your foundation. It's like a squatter in a mansion trying to charge the rightful owner for a room. But the moment the owner produces the original deed, the squatter's power vanishes. This history, these receipts, this uncle talk at the cookout, this is the deed to the world. So, what do you do now? You stop being a consumer of your own culture and start being the architect. You don't need to return to Africa. You need to return to the African mind. Reclaim the discipline of the Dogon who tracked the invisible. Reclaim the standard of the Moors who refused to live in the dark. Reclaim the confidence of the Cometians who built mirrors of the sky and the sand. The betrayal was deep, yes. The lie was massive, absolutely. But the pride you feel right now, that's not just an emotion. That's your ancestors' frequency finally finding a signal in the noise. They call it Moors and more for a reason, because there is always more to the story than they're willing to tell. They told you the book was closed, but we're just now starting to read the fine print. You are the descendants of the people who taught the world how to think. It's time to stop letting the students grade your homework. The lights are back on. The receipts are on the table, and the Dark Ages are officially over for anyone brave enough to see. You aren't just part of history. You are the source code. Now go out there and rewrite the program.